All right, guys, we're going to start with ocular anatomy, and we're going to start with your favorite, the eyelid. All right, guys, so we're going to jump into the eyelid right now, and the way we're going to do these videos is I'm going to map out pictures, right, to kind of simplify your notes, because I know sometimes just looking at your notes, like, you know, page by page, it can kind of be like, gosh, I just can't handle this stuff. So I'm going to draw like a picture. I'm going to put a lot of details into it. Then I'm going to quiz you on it. So let's get started right now. You can basically draw the picture I'm going to draw in your margin. You can pull out a separate piece of paper. I'd encourage you to do it in your margin. So like every time you're studying, it's all in one spot. It just allows everything to be simplified. So let's lock and roll right now, and we're going to take a look at this visual right now. All right. All right, guys, so as we look at the eyelid, you want to start with the levator, okay? That's going to be in the very center of the lid, okay? So I'm going to draw that first, just like this. So we'll put an L there for levator. And if I said what muscle is anterior to that, or in front of the levator, you'd want to have the orbicularis oculi come to mind, okay? That's going to be anterior to that. So another way they could ask that is just like if you were going to touch the skin right now on the outside part of your eyelid, the muscle just behind that skin is going to be the orbicularis oculi. Behind the levator is going to be a muscle. And in fact, the levator gives rise to this muscle, which by the way would be a great board question. That's going to be the muscle of Mueller. So where's the muscle of Mueller come from? It's derived off of the levator, okay? The muscle of Mueller is going to lead into a structure here that you guys are all over. You're like, Kyle, I know what that is. That's going to be the tarsal plate. If I said what glands are in the tarsal plate, you would say meibomian glands. I'd be like, yep. If I say anything else, and you would say the glands of Wolfram, okay? So that one may not be one that just rolls off your tongue, but you want to think, just take that M for meibomian and flip it on its back, and you think, there's two glands there, meibomian and Wolfram, okay? Now, if we had to kind of finish our eyelid like this, we're going to put an eyeball right here in the structure, okay? So I'm just going to put eye there. And it makes sense if I ask you the question, hey, out of all these layers of the lid, which layer is most equipped to handle infections of the eye? Like, where would you be able to, like, put PMNs, macrophages, all that good stuff to fight infections on the eye? You would say, Kyle, I'd want it to be the layer that's closest to the eyeball, which is that right there, which is obviously the palpebral conge, okay? So when you look in your notes, you're going to see that the palpebral conge is packed with PMNs, macrophages, things like that. Think of the palpebral conge as being protective, okay? That's kind of a good way to think about it, okay? As we get into physiology later on, you're going to see that the orbicularis oculi can be divided into kind of two portions. One portion is here by the eyelashes, okay? And that's going to be the palpebral portion, palpebral, okay? And the other one is up near the eyebrows, and it's called the orbital portion. We'll get more into this when we get into physiology, but I just kind of wanted to build that framework for you now to understand the big picture, okay? Where this gets really practical in terms of test questions, okay? Because that's just the basics. I know even if you haven't looked at anatomy in a while, you can look at that and be like, Kyle, I'm all over that. That's easy. If they asked you what glands are near the eyelash follicles, you're going to say the glands of Zeiss, okay? They're going to lubricate the lashes. If I said what other glands are right there, you're going to say the apocrine glands of mole, okay? Apocrine glands of mole. So I'm going to put an M there for the glands of mole. And the reason I stress apocrine is obviously that's the secretion. You'll see that in histology. Again, my focus is to pull in stuff from all different sections in one diagram to make your life a little bit easier, okay? Last but not least, you're going to see with the palpebral portion, when we get into physiology, there's actually two portions of the palpebral, the muscle of Horner and the muscle areolin. And you'll see this early in the anatomy chapter as well. We'll talk about both of those, okay? When you say reolin, I want you to use the phrase like reolin, think roll, like you're a Alabama fan, you'd say roll, tide, divide. Roll, tide, divide. So what do we mean by roll, tide, divide? Well, roll, I want you to think row, rotates the lashes, okay? Tide, I want you to think keeps the eyelid tight against the eyelid margin, keeps the eyelid tight against the eyeball, okay? And divide is the most important part. I want you to think for that, it divides the eyelashes into an anterior and posterior portion, okay? That's why we have anterior blepharitis and posterior blepharitis, right? That's going to be called the muscle of reolin, okay? So that's how you want to process that. Now, some additional test questions I would look for on this, and again, anytime we say something like this, guys, it's just based on our opinion. We don't know what they're going to ask on boards, okay? Even after boards are over, we're not going to poll you or send you an email and say, hey, how do we do in anatomy, or how do we do in physiology, or anything like that. This is just based on studying the matrix, okay? Some things I would look for, some obvious questions would be, what is the function of the muscle of Mueller, first of all? If the levator opens the eye, through what cranial nerve, by the way? You'd say cranial nerve 3, yes. If I said, what does the muscle of Mueller do? You would say, Mueller maintains the eye being open. So say that to yourself right now, Mueller maintains, okay? And not only does it maintain, so if I had my eyes closed and I opened it right now, that's the levator, obviously, right? It gives 15 millimeters of lift, okay? And then the muscle of Mueller is going to maintain it being open. So the fact I'm not going like this right now and my eyes are just staying open, that's the muscle of Mueller doing that, okay? And so if I said cranial nerve 3 innervates the levator, what cranial nerve innervates the Mueller, muscle of Mueller, you want to say that's a sympathetic nervous system, okay? So sympathetic nervous system is going to maintain it being open. So let's get practical for a minute. You guys have heard about a patient with a cranial nerve 3 palsy, right? How does the eye sit in a cranial nerve 3 palsy? You guys would say the eye sits down and out, right? And if I said, does the patient have a ptosis? You'd be like, yeah, you just told me a cranial nerve 3 innervates the levator. And if I said, is it a small ptosis or big ptosis? You would say, it's a 15 millimeter ptosis, big ptosis, right? What if I said, what's a condition that causes a small ptosis, like let's say a muscle of Mueller ptosis? You would say that has to be a problem, right, that screws up the sympathetic nervous system. And I'd say, yes, perfect. And I'd say, what's that condition? And you'd think about it and you'd say, that's Horner's syndrome, yes. You've heard in Horner's syndrome you have ptosis, anhidrosis, and meiosis, right? Yes, so with Horner's you want to think it's a lack of sympathetic, right? That's why they have this ptosis. How big of a ptosis? You would say 2 to 3 millimeter ptosis, right? So that's a great way they can tie in that concept. What about if I ask you a question like, tell me the name of a condition where if you look at someone and square in the face, their eyelid doesn't have a ptosis, it's actually retracted back, right? You would say, oh, that's thyroid, I'm all over that, right? The stare appearance, yes. And so I'd say, what's going on in thyroid? And you'd process it for a second, and you'd say, that must be a problem where you have like too much sympathetic, right? Because it's literally pulling the eyelid back. And I'd be like, yes, that's perfect, right? And so with thyroid, you want to think too much sympathetic. With Horner's, you want to think lack of sympathetic, okay? So that's how you process the eyelid, just kind of looking at the big picture there. That's the key points, guys, that I want to hit. I want to move on now to the eyebrows, and we'll go on to a cool picture here to help you picture this quickly. Okay, guys, let's talk about the eyebrows now. And if you look in the text, you're going to see it helps to function as for protection, for facial expression. You could also add like a little unibrow here and say fashion, right? But if we want to get into like test questions that could come up, we could look at the frontalis first of all, and this is an easy one, right? If I asked you what's its orientation, horizontal, vertical, or oblique, you guys would say it runs vertically like this, okay? And I'd say, yep. And what's a good test question they could ask about frontalis? Well, it would be that it helps compensate for a ptosis, okay? So if someone has a really big ptosis, like what type of ptosis? You'd say a levator ptosis, yep. Then in that situation, you're going to be big time using that frontalis muscle like crazy, okay? The one that I think would be another one I could help you with to save you time is the corrugator, okay? When you say corrugator, I want you to think corner, right here, corner of the eyebrows, okay? Corrugator, think corner. And you can see it runs obliquely, okay? Not horizontal, not vertical, but oblique. So therefore, its mechanism of action is going to be that it pulls the corner of the eyebrows down and in. Write that down in your notes, okay? Down and in, corrugator, down and in functions. So think corrugator, corner. I also want you to think corrugator, concentration, okay? That's what's going to basically pull the eyelids down and in when you're concentrating, perhaps like maybe what you're doing right now, okay? Hopefully you're just having the time of your life. That's why this guy's smiling right now, right? It's just like nothing else I'd rather do in my life than anatomy, baby, okay? The other thing I want to hit with you guys is the last but not least is procerus, okay? When you look at procerus, it's a stupid way to think about this. Procerus, think like rhinoceros. Rhinoceros have big noses, okay? So you can think cerus, think nose, because what you need to know about this is all about the nose. Right here on the bridge of the nose, it's going to pull the skin between the eyebrows straight down, okay? Not down and in, just straight down, okay? That's the procerus. So you want to think procerus, think all about the nose, starts at the bridge of the nose, pulls everything down. The other thing they could ask is like, which one of these muscles flares the nostrils, okay? That's all about the procerus again. So any question about the nose, think of the procerus as what you want to go to. All right, guys, so hopefully that makes sense. So it's quick and easy. I want to get into a really cool diagram now on the lacrimal system. Guys, as we draw this out, you've seen this before. You know about the lacrimal sac, the nasolacrimal drainage system, the valve of Hafner, all that stuff, right? But I want to show you some practical ways they could ask test questions about it. And in particular, I want to show you some cool things with the lacrimal gland on how to break that down in your mind and how to get into some minutia that, quite honestly, a lot of times students can overlook. So let's dive into that now. Okay guys, I know you've seen this type of schematic many times, right? I want to focus in on the canaliculi for a second, okay? You guys probably remember that there's 2 millimeters here and then 8 millimeters here. So I'm just going to put 2 and 8 just like that. Okay, you guys know that an infection of the lacrimal sac is called a dacryocystitis, right? An infection of the lacrimal gland is going to be called a dacryoadenitis, okay? I know you've seen these terms before. I just want to make sure we're on the same page because we're going to stretch those in just a minute. If I asked you guys what sinus is surrounding the nasolacrimal duct down here, okay? And by the way, this is obviously the nasolacrimal duct. If I said, what is the sinus around that? Okay, you'd want to be all over that. You'd say, that is called the maxillary sinus, okay? So we're going to put max right there for maxillary sinus, okay? The reason I love this, by the way, is because if they ask you a board question like, what's the #1 reason that someone gets a nasolacrimal duct obstruction, like a problem like that, okay? The first thing you want to think of is the question about a kid, or is the question about like a child, or is it about an adult, okay? If it's about a child, the answer is going to be that there's a problem with the valve of Hassner, okay? I'm just going to put an H there for the valve of Hassner, okay? That should be open. Obviously, if it's not open at birth, the patient's going to have epiphora, which means obviously the eye is going to water like that onto the surface of the cheek, okay? So bottom line is with nasolacrimal duct obstruction, if they ask you the #1 cause in a child, you're going to say a valve of Hassner issue. If it's an adult, they're going to have the same symptom, right? Unilateral epiphora, okay? Now, I want to just ask you, if it's an adult, the #1 reason, and by the way, this is going to be like a 60-year-old female that's going to come into your office, okay? And she's going to love it when you tell her, hey, the reason why you have this tearing onto your cheek, the #1 reason is because of this 3-letter word, baby, AGE, right? They love that, these 60-year-old women, right? And so on boards, what I would look for is that age-related stenosis, okay, is what we're looking for, which basically means this just becomes narrower with age, okay? So again, another way they could ask that on boards is involutional stenosis. So again, on boards, if they say, what's the #1 cause of a nasolacrimal duct obstruction in an adult, you want to think involutional stenosis, you want to think unilateral epiphora, be all over that on boards, okay? And you guys probably know, just as a reminder, because I know you've had this in school, but if they said, how would you test that, okay? You would do what's called Jones 1 and Jones 2 testing, right? Jones 1 testing, which you're going to see in disease, is all about fluorescein and 5. I want you to say that, fluorescein and 5. You're going to take a fluorescein strip, you're going to touch it on the eyeball, you're going to walk out of the room for 5 minutes. When you come back into the room, when you look at the eye, you should see no fluorescein on the eye, right? After 5 minutes, it should all be drained out. If you come back after 5 minutes, you see all this fluorescein on the front of the eye, then you're thinking, okay, I know there's probably a blockage here, right? So then you're going to do Jones 2, which is not fluorescein, it's saline, right? And you're going to inject that into the canaliculi. You're going to kind of go in, you're going to know you have 2 millimeters, and then you're going to flatten out a little bit. You're going to push, and if everything's wide open, when you push, right, it's going to just like, it's like you're pushing in thin air. It's really easy. But if you start to push and it feels like it's rock solid, right, like you're pushing into something hard, then you're like, all right, baby, game on. I'm going to go after this, right? And the whole time you're thinking, I just want to make the patient choke. Right, it sounds really bad, but it's actually a fun challenge. Like pushing as hard as you can, then all of a sudden, if it like this, then you know you've broken through that blockage. It's a big deal for you and for the patient because you've saved the patient from having to do a DCR, right? Reality is these things recur quite a bit, so you may have saved them now, but you might have to do it again in the future, which then you can just make them choke again in the future, right? It's fun. But bottom line is, when you think through that, the cool thing about this, if you know what I just said about nasolacrimal duct obstruction, if you understand the #1 cause in a kid is valve of Hassner, in an adult, it's going to be involutional stenosis. The #2 thing in an adult, though, would be a maxillary sinusitis, right? It'd be a sinus infection, which, by the way, doesn't happen that much. It's like almost always it's just age-related stenosis. But keep in the back of your mind, a sinus infection would do it. And if you picture that maxillary sinus is like right around the nasolacrimal duct, on board it's like, bring it on. Like, I got this down. Hopefully they'll ask you that question, okay? But here's the cool part. If you got all the stuff I just said about nasolacrimal duct obstruction, then you also get some other good test questions right as default. Because if you know what I just said, you're going to get something else right, which is this, okay? Is a dacryocystitis. If they ask you about the #1 cause of a dacryocystitis, the answer is exactly what we just said for nasolacrimal duct obstruction. Let me repeat that. If you know the answers for nasolacrimal duct obstruction, they're the exact same answers for a dacryocystitis. Let me show you this, okay? Let's take a look at the whiteboard here for a minute. So if you have a blockage down here, all the fluid is going to backflow. Like wherever you're at right now, if you're in a library or you're in your car, hopefully you're not driving, but wherever you're at, I want you to say backflow really loud, right? Because if you get a backflow into the lacrimal sac, and now you guys know, you could say, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, you guys know in your tears there's bacteria. So if it backflows and then settles in the sac, right, it's stagnant there, then you can get a major infection there, right? So the #1 reason for a dacryocystitis is a nasolacrimal duct obstruction, okay? Now I want to get into the lacrimal gland for a minute, and I want to talk about dacryoadenitis, okay? This would be hard, but if I said, what's the number one cause of a dacryoadenitis, okay? You'd want to think staph, right, which is not surprising. Staph is pretty common, but if I asked you about a systemic disease, which would be the number one cause of a dacryoadenitis, I want you to say sarcoid. And we're going to repeat this to a lot of the videos and in the live course, but every time we say sarcoid, I want you to say inflammation, sarcoid, inflammation, sarcoid, inflammation, because all throughout the eye and the body, it just causes inflammation. And you'll see a bunch of examples of that. You'll see it inflames the blood vessels in the retina, right? Vasculitis. It inflames the vitreous, vitritis. It inflames a cranial nerve 7, causing a Bell's palsy, right? We're going to get into all this. You don't need to write all that down right now, but just understand sarcoid. If I say sarcoid, you want to think inflammation, okay? If you were like a total stud, which I know so many of you guys are because optometry students are smart, you'd want to think mono would be another example of that, okay? Now hang with me because this is where you're going to want to throw something at the screen, okay? If I said, what's the purpose of the lacrimal gland, you would say it's going to push tears onto the front surface. You're like, yeah, thanks for wasting 30 seconds of my life. I know that, Kyle. But if I said, how does the lacrimal gland get the ability to produce those tears? Because that's a parasympathetic function, right? It needs a parasympathetic ganglion. And that's going to be the pterygopalatine ganglion. Oh yeah, I did say that. I know you're like, oh gosh. It's been a while since we've looked at that. There's another name for that, also called the sphenopalatine ganglion, okay? And on boards, they could ask you what cranial nerve allows for the lacrimal gland to produce tears. In other words, which cranial nerve provides parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal gland. That's a mouthful, isn't it? All right, here it is. So here's the cranial nerve, just like that. That's how I want you to picture it. It uses the pterygopalatine or the sphenopalatine ganglion, and that is going to be cranial nerve 7. Okay, so if I asked you guys, what does lacrimation, okay, you're going to say cranial nerve 7. All right, and if they want to get really picky, they might ask what branch of cranial nerve 7, and you're going to say the Vidian nerve of cranial nerve 7. If you're like, oh gosh, he's really stretching my brain right now, I want you to say out loud the Vidian nerve of cranial nerve 7. Okay, Vidian nerve. I'll just put a V-I-D-I-A-N, just like that. Vidian nerve of cranial nerve 7 is what does that. Last but not least is this. This will be picky, but you're going to see in your notes that you can divide that lacrimal gland into a palpebral portion, okay, and you can also divide it into an orbital portion, okay? And so we're going to put orbital right there. So what is that divider? What's this divider that divides it into a palpebral and orbital portion? That is the tendon of the levator, okay? You could think, why is that even important, and why am I even looking at that? Well, let's talk about that for a second. So this might be kind of picky, but on boards, I just want to tell you over and over, expect it to be picky. It's going to be very hard. We know that. I mean, we've seen every year the test seems to get harder and harder. We don't know why. We don't write the test. We don't have any input on the test. But they love to get picky. So this year especially, we're just loading up on videos like crazy just to make it simpler and simpler for you. So this is a really touchy, picky concept, right? But bottom line is, picture that lacrimal gland as having two parts, a palpebral and orbital portion. Say to yourself out loud, the palpebral produces. Palpebral produces, because you might think that both regions of the lacrimal gland produce fluid, but they don't. The palpebral produces, the orbital doesn't, okay? So if someone is suspected of having a lacrimal gland tumor and there's a physician going in to do a biopsy, they're not going to biopsy the palpebral portion because that's the useful portion. They're going to biopsy the orbital portion, okay? Again, picky ways that they could ask test questions, but that's how you want to kind of sort that out in your mind, okay? So guys, good job on all this. Hopefully that was helpful. We're going to jump in now to the orbit and start looking at the orbit and EOM. So get ready for some more fun, all right?